Go. Okay, right, that's recording. So this is a very simple scene with 3 balls, a ground and a sky dome light, a special kind of sky dome light, because this is a sun and sky dome light. This is a way of rendering in Maya and simulating the sun and the sky all in one light setup, without you having to even change the colors or anything like that. But that's kind of background to what we're going to see here, because we're going to do for some of you, our first render. To render something in Maya, we use Arnold, and Arnold is a renderer, which is like a program that sort of sits inside of Maya, that takes all of the wireframe stuff, all of the lights, and kind of cooks it all together and calculates the shadows and the light and material and gives you a final kind of still image. And the way to get that up and running, get that going, is to go to Arnold at the top here and open Arnold Render View. This will come up. So it's just a black screen at the moment, but it's got a little play button just here. And if we click that, it will render what you can see through this camera, and this camera is just called perspective at the moment, and it's telling you that it's rendering the perspective shape camera. Now this is an interactive render view, so it's going to constantly update whatever you change in the Maya scene. So if I change my view, so I can have this window sort of off to one side a little bit, and if I go back into the main Maya window and sort of orbit around the camera, you can see that it updates in the render view, and it does it in this kind of super pixely, gradually gets smoother kind of way. So this is really, really useful for when you're adjusting things like lights and materials, because you can see your changes happen straight away. Back in the bad old days, you would change something in your scene, and then you would have to hit render, and then you'd have to wait ages for it to even begin rendering. Nowadays, we have interactive preview renders, which are super nice, and they kind of constantly refresh whenever you change something. So let's have a look at materials. Let's select this ball just here and go into the attribute editor. So at the moment I'm in the modeling toolkit. You might be in the modeling toolkit, you might be in one of the others, but whatever, wherever you are, whichever one of these is showing, I want you to go to the attribute editor. And the attribute editor for that ball has a bunch of things that were done to make that ball, and a bunch of nasty, confusing sort of options that you'll probably never ever touch. But you see here there's a little arrow here. If we sort of click that several times, we get to the very, very end, and you'll see this thing called Material 1. And if you click that little tab, we have the settings for this material. So what is a material? You create an object, and by default it will have a default material on it, which is just a sort of flat greyish kind of material. But you can apply new materials, and materials tell Arnold how shiny the object is, what colour the object is, how see-through the object is, how reflective, how rough. It defines all of those material characteristics, and the most commonly used ones are already sort of unrolled here in the material section of the attribute editor. We have things called weight and colour and roughness and metalness. They all do slightly different things. Let's just look at the most basic ones first. So here we've got colour, and by default here our colour is white. If I click, and I want you to try this too, if I click that little colour swatch, up comes a colour picker, a little bit like you would see in Photoshop. So you can change the colour of all these balls at the same time. You make them whatever colour you want. You can make them more saturated, more brighter, less saturated, darker. So you can change the colour of an object. So let's choose a nice, bright, saturated blue. That's probably the most self-explanatory of all of them. What does the weight do above it? The weight controls, this is kind of like the overall colour of your object, not the color of any reflection or the color of any, or if it were glass, it's not the color of the glass itself. This is kind of the surface overall color. And weight is how much influence that color should have on the final render. It's at 0.8 at the moment, but if I lower this down, this slider, it'll get darker. Because it's saying this base color has less and less impact on the overall shading of the object. If I go higher, if I go to 1, it says this has almost total kind of, 100% of this color is being used to define the surface color of the object. So that's color. Let's skip diffuse roughness. We don't need to worry about that. In fact, we hardly ever need to worry about that. Metalness. Now, metalness is a slider as well, but really, something is either metal or it isn't metal. So even though this is a slider, there should really only ever be two values used for this: 0 or 1. You see what happens when you make it 1? Suddenly, well, you get a much more metallic kind of look. Because metalness, though, but metalness is more than just the sort of reflection. Metalness controls how the diffuse color, the base color, works as well. And notice as well, as soon as you go to 1, that diffuse roughness gets grayed out. You can't change that anymore. You're locked to it. We'll get into this more in Substance Painter and how we do it. But for now, metalness should really only be either 0 or 1. So if it's 0, this is still shiny, but it kind of looks like shiny plastic or maybe ceramics. At 1, now it looks more like a kind of blue chrome kind of ball. So you can mess around with that. Now, I mean, obviously, I say 0 or 1, but this is computer graphics, so you can take reality and you can kind of mess around with it and see what would a half metal ball look like. Not massively exciting, but that's kind of what it would look like. But yeah, most of the time this is 0 or 1. Now we're going to jump down to what's called specular. The name specular is a little bit of a holdover from the days when computer graphics were trying to cheat and represent reality by using a bunch of tricks and stuff that didn't really properly mimic how the real world works. There were kind of lots of little cheats and tricks. And the little shiny hotspot you see on here used to be called a specular reflection. Instead of specular, I want you to just, I want your eyes to see that as just reflection. Because in today's rendering world, in today's PBR rendering world, which is physically based rendering, the renderer can actually mimic reality pretty well and actually behaves a lot more like the real world materials and lights behave. But it's still called specular in Maya. But I want you to just see this as reflection instead. So you could have, by default, it's got 100% reflection. But notice 100% reflection doesn't make it a mirrored ball, because that's another thing as well that is a little bit strange if you've never come across it before. But if I move this down to nothing, there's no specularity or no reflection, and you get this totally sort of smooth but sort of powdery looking dull kind of ball. Put that up to 1 and you get it looking shinier. But notice how, with the exception of this little hot spot here, the reflection looks a little bit stronger around the outside edges than it does in the middle. This is called the Fresnel effect, and this happens with absolutely everything in nature. What the Fresnel effect is that when you look at an object and the angles become more and more of a glancing angle, it becomes, to our eye, more reflective. But then when you look at a reflective object dead on, it's slightly less reflective, other than if you were looking obviously at a perfect mirror. This is everywhere. You'll notice this on water, you'll notice this on all kind of shiny reflective kind of objects. You can change that, you can change the way that behaves, but I wouldn't bother fiddling around with it at the moment. Just know that it's set up to work kind of to give you this sort of vaguely plasticky kind of look. You can change the color of the reflection, but again, I would let's just change it. See what happens if we change this to a sort of orangey kind of color. see what's happening here is you're sort of tinting the color of the reflection. This kind of begins to gradually get away from real life and more into sort of art directed kind of looks. And even though that sounds appealing, because it sounds like, oh, art directed, I get to decide how good it looks rather than a computer, it's still best to try and keep everything working as realistically as possible. And if you want a different kind of reflected look, to try and sort that stuff out in Substance Painter instead, which we'll get onto. Probably the most important setting in Specular or reflection is Roughness, which controls essentially overall roughness in many ways. So with not much roughness at all, we get shiny plastic looking kind of snooker balls or billiard balls. As we move this roughness slider up, it becomes less plasticky and kind of duller instead. You see how that, you notice it most on that highlight. And as you move it all the way up to the top, you essentially get back to the same look as if you'd taken the weight of the specular slider down to 0, to nothing. It's this roughness, as we move into Substance, you'll notice this roughness is almost responsible for how cool your your final materials and textures kind of look, because you can make really, really rich looking surfaces just by varying the roughness across them. Okay, so that's kind of that's kind of like materials, very, very, very briefly. You can assign a new material to an object. I'm going to stop this render by clicking the stop button and getting rid of the dialog box there. You can assign a new material to an object, because these all share the same material at the moment, by selecting the material, selecting the object, and then holding down the right mouse button, and all the way down the bottom here, you've got this assign new material. And when you let go on that, this is going to pop up again with a bewildering array of potential options to click. But don't worry, just click Arnold, and that will filter out most of them already. And then you'll see these Arnold shaders or Arnold materials. It's to get everything looking nice and sort of, I'm going to say realistic, and it will look roughly realistic, but don't let that put you off in terms of, well, I can only ever create realistic stuff. Depending on how much you treat your image afterwards, you can make it look less realistic. But they all these Arnold materials and the Arnold lights and the Arnold renderer, when they work together, do end up producing fairly realistic results. So it's important to use these Arnold materials. And the one you're going to be using, again, 99.9% of the time, is this one called AI Standard Surface. So if you click that, that's assigned a new material to this ball. These ones have still got the old one. This one's got a new one. And by default, this new material is just called any old name. But let's give this a name and call it My First Material. And it's white, and it's got these default settings. Let's get to the fun part, or the funner part anyway. What I'd like you to all do is to go to the Start menu and scroll down until you get to this one called Allegorithmic, just here. Hopefully it's showing up on your PC. And if you open that up, you've got all of Allegorithmic's software. And the one we're going to be using is Substance Painter. So click Substance Painter, and that should start Substance Painter up. I've already got it running. I'm going to switch it off and just run it myself, just to show you the dialog box that will probably come up when you load it. Shouldn't take too long to load. It should be much quicker than Maya to load. Okay. Here we go. So this will come up. This will probably come up when you load Substance Painter up. It will say new version. It might say, as I said, it will probably say new version available. Say no, you don't want to download it because you can't install anything on here, because none of us have got administrator privilege to install anything. So click no. Then you got Welcome to Substance Painter. It's got a few introductory tutorials which you could start looking at later. It would be helpful. But just click close for now. And let's just go back to Maya, because we've just got Substance loaded up. We're going to load something in a moment. Now, those were the materials in Maya, right? So you can change the color, and you can change the metalness and the roughness. But these are just one overall value. So if I give this ball a color, the whole ball gets that color. If I change its metalness, the whole ball gets one metalness value. The same with the roughness. To get more realistic, to get more interesting looking materials, it would be better if we could vary the color, or if we could vary where it's rough and where it isn't rough. And we do that by assigning textures to objects. Now, I'm going to treat you as if you have no idea at all. So some people obviously have got some idea, but I'm going to assume that you've got zero idea. What a texture is it's just an image that gets fed into this material and will then change these parameters over the surface of the object. So if you had an image of a flag and you loaded that flag image into color, your ball would have that flag wrapped around it. How it gets wrapped around is to do with something called its UV maps, but again we're going to get into that in more detail a little bit later on in the semester. But textures allow us to change these. So textures allow us to change the colors, but they will also allow us to change where it's metal and where it isn't metal, and where it's rough and where it isn't kind of rough. And this is where Substance comes in. Back in the old days, or back on Games Art, if you were on Games Art and you've transferred, you were probably made to use Photoshop to texture your stuff as a kind of trial by fire kind of thing, a sort of you have to learn the ways before you can do it the easy way. But most of us here are concept artists, I think with the exception of one person. We don't have to worry about that. We can just make it look good. And so we can use Substance. We're going to skip Photoshop. I would maybe use Photoshop for very, very rare occasions to do texturing in Maya these days, but most of the time I'm going to be using Substance because it's easier and you just produce much, much better results. But first of all, we need to send one of these objects to Substance. So how do we do that? You select the object you want, and then you've got to go to File, Export Selection. Not Export All, Export Selection. This should pop up. Let's make sure, first of all, we want to save it in our project, not in downloads. So let's save it in Assets. So you've got your current project here. I'm in Anthony project at the moment. Yours might be different. It could be your name. It could be default. But let's go to Assets. So we're going to save this ball in Assets. And we're not going to save it as a Maya binary. We're going to save it as an FBX export down the bottom. So click that. And we're just going to call it, I don't know, just call it ball, I guess. And then export selection. It should be really, really quick because it's just a very, very simple object. So we've saved out that ball essentially from the scene. We've did as its own separate kind of mini object called a ball.fbx, so that we can now load that individual ball into another program. And we're going to load it into Substance Painter. So now let's switch to Substance Painter. Now your view might look like this instead when you load it up. It could have two. If it is, I want you to go up to this bit here where it says 3D, 2D. If you let your mouse cursor hover over it, just click that once and go to 3D only. It's the equivalent of, in Maya, tapping space on the perspective viewport. But we've got a big empty scene at the moment in Substance Painter because we need to load our object in. So the way we load our object in is we see import resources, but that's not what we want. We actually just want new. You're going to click new ... And you'll get this new project dialog box pop up. Now the first thing is the template, because Substance can texture things in loads of different ways. But we want it to texture it in a very specific way, and what we want is this PBR metallic roughness, algorithmic. So it's just underneath non-PBR and just above the alpha test one. So it's just here. PBR, metallic, roughness, algorithmic. Next thing we got here is file. Now this file is that ball that we've just saved out. So we're going to go to select, and we're going to browse to where our ball is. So it was in Maya, so documents, Maya, projects. I saved it into my Anthony project, so I'm going to go into there, and I saved it into assets, and there it is. It's a ball. Hopefully you can also find your ball as well, and then just click open. Now it's not going to open it straight away. We've got a bunch of different options here as well. Now you can ignore most of these. You've got here the document resolution. This is maybe the only one that you'll find interesting. By default it's 1024. This is essentially going to be how big the textures are going to be in resolution. The higher the resolution, the more detail you can have. But the amazing thing about algorithmic is, and Substance Painter, is that you can paint in low resolution, but then export high resolution with no loss of quality. Which again, anyone who's a little bit computer savvy, who has had any kind of experience with these kind of things before, that might be quite a cool thing to know. So all we have to do now is click OK. And after a few moments, our ball appears. And it's a white ball, very much like it was in Maya. And straight away you can see your mouse cursor, as you hover over it, has like a little, that's essentially like it's just exactly the same as a Photoshop brush. But when you put it on your object, you see that it follows the curve and the surface of your object. Now you can scroll around your object and stuff in Substance using exactly the same method that you use in Maya. So holding Alt and the middle mouse button does that. Alt and the right mouse button tracks in and out, and Alt and the left mouse button lets you kind of rotate around the object. But we just deal with one object at a time normally in Substance. So what does Substance Painter, what actually does it do, and how does it work? It works a lot like Photoshop. So let's ignore all this stuff here to begin with and go straight to here, the layers. By now most of you have used Photoshop, so this should look fairly familiar. It works in exactly the same way. At the moment we've got one transparent layer. When you want to create a new layer, you click that little add layer button. That creates a new transparent layer, and you've got blending mode normal and blending amount, exactly the same as Photoshop. When you want to get rid of a layer, you just hit the trash can, and the layer that you've clicked on that's highlighted with blue is the layer that's active, that you're painting on. Okay? Just a second, George. I'm just going to do this. So at the moment I'm on layer 2, and I've got this little mouse, this little brush. These are the brush settings down here. So you've got size, and it gives you a handy little image of the stroke, so you can get it a really small brush or a massive brush. And you've got flow and stroke, opacity and spacing, all very, very much like Photoshop. But when you get down to the bottom part, this is where you decide what you're actually painting. Because whereas in Photoshop, you paint just with color, right? Or you might paint with like a mask, just transparency. Substance is different. Substance lets you paint in color, but it also lets you paint height information, roughness information, metalness, normalness, and other stuff as well. By default, it's going to be painting with all 5 of these things. But at the moment, I only want to paint in color. So how do I only paint in color? I click off what I don't want to paint with. So I'm going to click off height, rough, metal, and norm, which stands for normal. So now the only 2 things here are material or base color. So if I change base color, if I click that and just change something, and you can see what it was going to look like just here. Now if I paint, you can directly onto my object. So if you hold down your left mouse button, just paint, you can see it's painting this red kind of color. But that's only the beginnings of it, because as I said, Substance lets you paint not just with color, but with entire materials. So if I click on roughness, you see this comes up here. And it's just got a slider between 0 and 1. Look at what happens to the little preview here when we move this slider. It's exactly the same as back in Maya when we moved this slider just here. In fact, Maya tries to show you as well in a little preview. So at the moment it's not very rough. The rougher it gets, that highlight disappears. Exactly the same thing happens in Substance. But now when I paint, so if I paint with hardly any roughness, in other words very shiny, you can see I'm painting not just with red, but I'm painting a shiny kind of red. But if I move this slider up so it's very rough and I paint, now it's no longer shiny. This is a really important thing to bear in mind. And I can paint with even more things. So I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to paint a little bit of red on this base kind of layer. And that's not very shiny. I'm going to create a new layer using this little button. And with this layer, I'm going to make it shinier and a different color. And because this layer is on top of this layer, when I paint over the top, now I've got kind of a shiny blue over the top of a non-shiny red. Now I can even add height to this. So if I click on height, again I get a little slider. Now if I move this slider up, like this, let's find a better angle. Actually no, I'm going to show you with better kind of colour so it shows up better. Let's get rid of both of those. But anyway, this works obviously a lot like as I said, Photoshop. So I can create another layer on top, change this again, change the roughness, and paint over. Oh yeah, now I'm painting with height, as you can see. But Substance comes with all these things down the bottom here. This is the bit that's going to make your life super easy, or easier anyway. Because if I create a new layer, just a brand new empty layer, and I'm going to turn off, I'm going to turn everything back on. So instead of choosing a color and individually setting all of these settings myself, I can instead go to the Material Node button. And if I click that, I get a whole bunch of preset materials. So let's paint with concrete. So this is an actual material in Substance that now let me paint concrete texture directly onto my object. And you see it's got like bumpness and roughness as well. And I can paint another material on top of that. So I could create another new layer. And this time I could get rid of that material by clicking the little X. And click it again, and this time choose a different material, like maybe carbon fiber. That's quite cool. And now I'm painting carbon fiber over the top. So this is how in Substance you can build up very, very complicated looking materials, but without you having to paint abstract black and white stuff in Photoshop then you bring into Maya, and then you kind of assign to the roughness and think, does that work or does that not work? In Substance, it's a lot more straightforward. You're literally just placing materials onto objects. Let me show you one more thing, and we're going to get some textures out of Substance into Maya. So we've been painting on transparent layers at the moment. Something that's more commonly done in Substance is to not really paint on transparent layers to begin with, but to just add fill layers, where you flood fill an entire object. So if I click Add Fill Layer, nothing much seems to be different. I've still got the same settings down here, but this time, instead of painting it, if I change the color, for example, it's just going to change the entire object. But if I change the material node, I can just choose one of these here, and I'm going to choose quite a few down here. I'm going to choose Iron Raw. You can choose whatever you like. So now you've got this kind of battered up iron kind of look. Now, the reason why you're getting this happening is the UVs on the object were just thrown on. They're not put on particularly well. As I said, we're going to get into UVs in a few sort of sessions down the line about what they are and how to use them. But what you might be able to do to lessen that look is change this, when you've applied that substance material, that iron damaged or whatever you've put on, at the top you should have this thing called projection, and at the moment it's going to be UV projection. I want you to put that as triplanar projection, and you should notice that those seam lines are softened a little bit. Yeah, sure. I'll do the whole thing again just because it's so quick and it's easy to show you. So add a fill layer, which is this little paint bucket. I'm going to scroll down to where it says material mode. I'm going to click that button. I'm going to choose a material. I'll choose a different one this time. I'll choose gold pure. And you get gold pure turn up just here. Actually no, I am going to do it with that iron raw because it shows off that seam better. So I'm going to go down to iron raw. You see this ugly kind of seam happen, although in some ways you might think, oh, that's quite cool. That works quite well for some kind of spherical death thing or droid or something like that. But you've got these nasty seams, and if you want to get rid of those seams or you want to minimize those seams in substance, then it's this option at the top here called projection, UV projection. Click on that, and you've only got two options, and just switch it to triplanar projection. Little box pops up, and those seams, if they don't completely go, then they're certainly minimized. So you got that kind of look. Now, so that was painted, that wasn't really painted, that was just added to a fill layer. Let's add another fill layer on top. And notice this new fill layer on top is white and it's got no detail on it, so it instantly goes over the top of our iron raw that's underneath it. But notice how the bumpiness of the iron raw does carry through, because there is some bumpiness on the iron raw, but there's no bumpiness on a default fill layer. So it's not like there's a bumpiness on this layer that overwrites the stuff below. The stuff from below carries through if it's not overwritten. I know it's a bit of a it's a bit of a messed up thing to try and get your head around initially. If this had bumpiness to it, it would be combined with the bumpiness below it. This bumpiness is showing through, but this does have color, so this does go over the top of the other color. So let's change this color. Let's make this color like a paint. So I'm going to go down the bottom here because I think there's one down the bottom. I'm going to go to glossy plastic. So it instantly makes it look like blue glossy plastic. I'm going to change it to a different color. I'm going to change it to sort of, oh yeah, a nice vivid pink. How now, though, to blend between, how would you make it look as you had this super lovely bright pink plastic was actually paint on top of some rough looking metal. Again, some of you might have like a light bulb moment in a moment. You do it in the same way that you'd use Photoshop with layer masks. You build it up, so you literally imagine what is a painted iron ball. But it's a ball made of iron with a coating of paint over the top. And over the years, maybe some of it gets scuffed off or something like that. Well, how do we do that? We've got our bottom layer, which is the iron, and the layer on top, which is the paint. Now let's eat away at some of that paint to show through the iron underneath. So let's add a layer mask, which should be, hopefully by now, a term that you're familiar with in Photoshop. So the way we can do that, you can either apply it just here, add mask, or you can right mouse button any layer, and the first few options you get are add masks. I'm going to add a white mask. And just like a layer mask, where it's white, all of this layer is going to show. Where it's black, it's not going to show. So, and you know that the mask is active because it's got the little, it's highlighted in blue. If I click on that one, that means the fill layer itself is active. Click on that one, now the mask is active. And with a mask, you can paint into it. So here's our brush. Let's change a brush though. If we go to brushes, You get a ton of different brushes, preset brushes, very much like Photoshop brushes that are that Substance comes with. So I'm going to choose something like that. No, anything actually. Something I know. Yeah, Dirt Splash. That looks good. So if I click that, it essentially loads a bunch of presets into my brush, and you can see it up here. Now it works in the same way as Photoshop. So those square brackets will increase or decrease your brush size. And now when I paint black into this mask, it's going to eat away at where the pink paint is, and you're going to see the iron underneath. Like that. See? And now you can keep on adding to this. So what if on top of the paint there was a layer of dust? So let's add another new layer, another fill layer, and this time let's decide it ourselves. So let's make the color a kind of browny, light browny kind of color. And we've got to think to ourselves, what is dust? Dust is actually millions of little bits of dead skin and other bits of fluff, and it's super, super rough. It doesn't have any shininess at all. So we've defined the color, but let's make sure that it's really, really rough. Like that. Now, you can make it look like a thin layer of dust over top of the whole thing simply by messing around with the opacity, which kind of fades between the two. But again, it's better, I think, to have a mask. So if I right mouse button, click, and this time I'm going to put a black mask. So if I put a black mask, the dust is going to instantly disappear. And if I go and choose a nice soft kind of cottony brush, I think, something like that, and I paint with white, I'm painting the dust back on top. So you can paint dust and muck and dirt like this as well. And because it's like Photoshop, it's layers, it means that it's going to go on top of everything. So it's going to go over the top of the paint and the metal. But I'm going to get rid of that because that's not very good dust, is it? Instead, I'm going to add one more transparent layer. And I think I'm going to get rid of that material and choose a new one. So I'm going to look at materials in this area this time, just to show you how you can do this. So you can browse your materials here, and the material that you like, you can just drag and drop onto the material mode just here. So I'm going to choose, you choose anything you like. I'm going to choose Rust Fine. So now I'm painting with rust. So I'm going to paint here my initials, A, W, M, like that. So notice the order of them. At the very, very bottom, there is some metal, some iron. Then there's paint on top, and then there's rust that we've used to paint on top of all of it. If I go back to the paint, and I go to, if I activate height, I can add some height to the paint, which makes it look even more realistic. Can you see how it looks like now that the paint actually has some thickness lying on top of the metal? Figuring all this out and creating this in Photoshop, map by map, would be just way more time consuming and a lot less fun, a lot less just twiddling sliders and going, oh yeah, I like the look of that, or I don't like the look of that. So I can create a material like this. Okay, let's quickly get this back into Maya before I run out of audio recording time, and show you how it all connects up. So when you've got to a certain point and you're happy with your textures and you want to get them back into Maya, you go to File, Export Textures. So everyone do that, and this should come up. This is going to show you the different textures that are going to be spat out of Substance to be taken back into Maya. There's quite a lot in here. We don't need all of these. So what we can do is we can go to Configuration. So by default you're on Export, but if you go to Configuration, you can see a bunch of presets and another very confusing dialog box with lots and lots of potential options that thankfully you don't have to worry too much about at the moment. in Maya, we use Arnold 5. So we might as well start from there. So if you click Arnold 5, that shows you what it would output. It would output base color that goes into base color, metalness, roughness, and also these things called normal, height, and emissive. We don't need all of these. So what we're going to do here is we're going to right mouse button on Arnold 5 and go duplicate. And it will pop a copy of it down at the bottom. So you click that, which should already be clicked by default. You can get rid of some of these things. So I'm going to get rid of emissive by clicking that little X. And I'm going to get rid of height by clicking that little X. So it's going to leave me with base color, metalness, roughness, and normal. So everyone's hopefully done that. Let's go back to export and the config just here. So we click that. Now at the very, very bottom now, we should see that copy that we made. Arnold 5 standard copy. So you click this, and now it shows you my first material. It's going to give you base color, metalness, roughness, and normal. This is the resolution that it's going to output them at. So we were painting in 1024, but there's nothing stopping us from going much higher if we wanted to. And we would not get a blurry version of that that's just been enlarged. It would be lovely and crisp. And that's, again, one of the incredible things about Substance, that it allows you to work in low res, but export a high res. But I'm going to keep it as 1024 at the moment because I'm not too bothered about high resolution. The final thing I'm going to do is decide where those textures are going to go, which is this button here. So if I click this, by default, it's going to chuck them in Documents, a Logarithmic, Painter, Export. But let's put it actually in our Maya project. So if we go to Documents, Maya, Projects, I'm going to my one, you go to yours, and then you want to put it into Source Images. This is where Maya expects textures to go. So once you've browsed into there, you can go Select Folder, and you should see it looks like that, or something like that. And when you've done that, then you are safe to hit Export. And it'll do it super quick, because Substance, again, is pretty quick. I mean, it'll take longer. The more complicated you make your materials, it will gradually take longer and longer. And obviously, at a higher resolution, it will take longer. But overall, it is a pretty quick process. So that says, export successfully finished. You can OK, or you can go Open Folder, just to sort of satisfy your paranoia that it really has put them there. And you'll see it's put a texture there. 4 textures that it said it was going to create: base color, metalness, normal, and roughness. Right, let's bring these into Maya. So if you go back to Maya, make sure you've got your ball selected, the one that you exported. And what we're going to do now, we're going to open yet another new part of Maya. We're going to open up the Hypershade, which is where you can add or build complicated looking materials. You can sort of do it in the attribute editor, but we're going to do a couple of things that are going to require the Hypershade. So if you click that little ball, then after a certain amount of time, this pops up. You can see how this is just a mirror of what's in the attribute editor. And these are all the materials in our scene at the moment. Now, if you did the same as me, then you should be able to recognize my first material, the one that you just made. Otherwise, your material might be just called Material 1 or Material 2 or Material 3. It's another good reason why it's important to name your materials so you can keep track of them. So if you click My First Material, nothing happens. And then you click this little button here, Input and Output Connections. This pops up. Now what this is the material itself with all its different options, and it's plugged into the surface of your object. And you notice that when you click these, different options turn up here. We can do most of what we need to do now to take these textures in this Hypershade, as we call it, area. And it is a bit laborious, and there's no way you're going to remember it all on the first go. And this is obviously why I record it, and why I'll probably be doing it multiple times throughout the semester. Because the settings now are quite important to make sure everything works right. The first thing you want to do is make sure that weight is set to 1. The second thing you want to do is click this little checkerboard next to color slider. Make sure it's the color slider, make sure it's not the roughness or the metalness or any of the others, and make sure it's not the weight either, because it can be very easy to accidentally click the weight instead. You want the color. So when you click that, this turns up, which is a bit like our shader when we created a new material. What we want is file, because we're going to load a file into the color. So click file just here. Automatically it's added some stuff into this graph. Now you can build this graph manually if you want by dragging and dropping all these little connections and connecting them all up. But thankfully Maya does most of this automatically when you add textures. Now, without clicking off anything, you want to go, we're in the file node here, and there's a bunch of settings, but we don't have to worry about virtually any of these settings at the moment, other than this image name and the little folder icon. So if we click that, finally it's bringing us to a browser where we can select our textures. And because we put our textures in source images of our project, it's dumped us into the source images folder, so we don't have to go hunting for these textures. And we want base color because we're loading in the color. So just click base color and click open. This little preview shader ball shows you what's happening. So we've loaded the base color in, and we don't have to do anything else, thankfully. We can just go now back to my first material by just clicking on this node here. So we were on here, now we're back onto here again, and we can see instead of the checker box, it's got the connection sign telling you that, and look, the slider for the color's gone as well, because now we've got a texture map into here. Let's skip diffuse roughness and go to metalness and click that little checker box. And we're going to repeat what we did. We're going to go to file. Again, it adds a new little node here and it connects it up to here at the moment, because you can't see the metalness on here. It's connecting it to the top, but rest assured it is connected to the metalness. Now we want to choose our metal texture. So we click on the folder and click metal, and notice how the metal texture is pure white and pure black, because it's essentially telling Maya where it's white, make it pure metal, and where it's black, make it not metal at all. Or give that metal slider a value of 1 where it's white and 0 where it's black. So selected metalness and click open. Now we do have to change some settings here to make this work. The first thing we've got to change is this color space. We have to put that as raw. What we're saying here essentially is we are not using this texture as a color texture. It's going to have no effect on the color of the object. We're using it purely to tell Maya whether parts of the object are metal and parts of the object are not metal. So we're just using it for the raw data. So it's raw. The other thing we have to remember to do, which is a bit annoying, is click on this alpha is luminance checkbox. And then we've done it. So we've applied the metalness texture map. Let's go back into first material. So now you see there's a little connector here where metalness is. The next one we want to change is not the color of the reflection or the specularity, but the roughness. So again, click the little checkbox, go to File, go to the folder, little icon, and select your roughness. Now, be careful not to select your normal. Your normal looks like a weird bluey purple kind of image. Your roughness is going to look like a little bit like the metalness one, except it's not going to be pure white and pure black. It's going to be grayscale. So select your roughness, click open, and again change it from sRGB to raw, and make sure alpha is luminance is on. We're almost there. Now we need to manually add the normal map. Now the normal map is what's going to make it look bumpy and give it that sense of height and bumpiness. And there's that weird kind of purpley, bluey purple texture map. But we have to add this manually. And the way we do this is that in this graph editor, if you just click into an empty space and you hit the tab key, that's the key above caps lock next to Q. And a little floating dialog box comes up, and if you start to type bump, B-U-M-P, it'll filter everything out apart from 4 options, and you just want the first option, bump 2D. See, it's created this new little node here. Now, it's got out normal and normal camera. You want to connect these two things together by hovering over the little dot on the bump 2D and then clicking and dragging with your left mouse button until it connects up with the normal camera. It should sort of pop and lock into place, and then let go and it's connected up. Right? That's the first thing you have to do. Then make sure you're in your bump 2D node and that it looks like this. You want to change use as. Now by default it's bump. If you click that, you've got 3 options. You want tangent space normals. It's just telling Maya that you're going to use a normal map as opposed to a bump map. A normal map is that weird purpley one. So click that. And then we want to map the texture map into the bump value. So you go to the checkerboard next to the bump value and do a similar thing as we did before. We go to File, and then Image Name, and you want the normal map, and click Open. Again, this has to be set to raw. Now by default, it would have switched alpha luminance on for you, so you don't have to worry about that. But it still does need to be ticked on, but this time you probably didn't need to actually click it. Now the final thing you need to do is go up to here next to presets where it says toggle between look dev view and attribute editor view, and click that. Now if you click the bump 2D node, because at the moment you're on the file node, or you probably are, click on the bump 2D node and open up the Arnold box here. Now again, by default it's probably hidden, so you want to make sure you're on bump 2D node. So if you're on the file node you won't see that, but if you're on bump 2D node you will, but only if you have clicked this little button here, and then you unroll that Arnold box and you just click off these two. Now that texture map is applied to that ball, and we can see that it's applied by clicking on this little textured circle just here. I'm going to rotate this round so we can see it. You can see the rust and you can see the AWM. And now when we render it in Arnold, so we go back up to Arnold, open Arnold render view and click that play button. Now the texture that we made in Substance is on our Arnold ball and should look, if not exactly the same, pretty close. It's always going to look a bit different because Substance has got its own kind of built-in renderer that's a bit different from Arnold. But the important thing is we've transferred all our textures from Substance over into Maya and Arnold. And that's the gist of it. So I'm going to stop the recording